Hi, it's Fraser here. Before we get into this week's Spike podcast, I just wanted to let you know about a very special event we've got coming up. Spiked will be returning to the Battle of Ideas, Britain's premier ideas festival where free speech truly reigns. While we're there, Spiked will be recording a very special live edition of this podcast. That'll be on Saturday, the 28th of October at 12:15 p.m. For the pods, joining me will be Tom Slater, as per usual, plus some special guests, including Konstantin Kisin, Rakib Hassan, and Inaya Falarin Iman. Now, if you haven't got your ticket already to the Battle of Ideas, then now is the time to get one. It won't just be our podcast. We'll also be recording a special edition of Last Orders with Tom Slater, Chris Snowden, and special guests to come. Plus, across the weekend, there will be loads of Spiked writers speaking on all kinds of panels, as well as hundreds of other fascinating thinkers. To get your ticket for the Battle of Ideas, just go to battleofideas.org.uk, and while you're there, you can use the promo code SPIKED to get yourself 20% off a ticket. That's battleofideas.org.uk and the promo code SPIKED to get yourself a 20% off discount. See you at the event. Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week, as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And we're delighted to welcome to the show for the first time, editor of the Jewish Chronicle and author of the brand new book, Israelophobia, Wallis Simons.
Hi.
Welcome to the show. Coming up on today's show, we'll be discussing the war in Gaza, the return of Islamist terror to Europe, and Australia's rejection of the Voice to Parliament. So at the time we're recording this, Israel is still readying its essentially ground assault on Gaza. One of the big stories that's really caught the public imagination this week was the tragic bombing or the explosion in a hospital. People really seized on this quite quickly. They pointed the finger at Israel, probably before we really knew all that much. What do you think that tells us about how the world sees Israel, how the world is responding to this conflict?
Well, I think the first thing it tells us is the effectiveness of Hamas propaganda. And by that, I don't just mean the propaganda that's put out by Hamas terrorists, but the propaganda that's put out by the various coronas of sympathizers that they have, ranging from the inner circle of people who actually hold a jihadi worldview, all the way through to the useful idiot in Britain who thinks, well, there are two sides to Hamas, aren't there? Or there are two sides to every story. All the Israelis are all that equivocation. And I think that it's fascinating to me that the initial reporting leaned heavily on Hamas officials saying that this was an Israeli act of aggression. I can't imagine the BBC or any other respectable broadcaster relying to the same extent on officials from Islamic State when the RAF was bombing the hell out of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Islamic State and Hamas and Al-Qaeda share the same ideological root in the Muslim Brotherhood. It spawned these three major terrorist groups. And the Muslim Brotherhood itself was spawned out of a mixture of Nazi ideology with Islamism during the Second World War. And they use this, we've seen over the past 10 days that they use the same techniques, have the same worldview. They're all trying to take over the world and make it into a caliphate. They all, behead people, have no compassion for women, children, babies. And to sort of wind this back to the moment when the rocket hits the hospital, and the BBC receives a call from the Hamas, from the ISIS, saying that was the Israelis, and then reports it almost within a whisker of being fact, tells us so much about how much sympathy, how much legitimacy this ISIS-style terror group has managed to get from useful idiots over the last 20 years.
And on the other side, do you think it says something about the sort of hatred of Israel? The way that people would just say, that's the kind of thing they would do. I'd expect them to do something as cruel as this.
Exactly right. I mean, and that stretches back such a long time. Not just 75 years ago when Israel was established, but I'm talking about thousands of years. You can no longer say that, as people did in the Middle Ages, that the Jews kidnap Christian children to kill them and use their blood in their ritual cooking. But you can say that the Zionists are baby killers.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. And because it's so deeply culturally embedded, because Christianity is still the kind of cornerstone of Western civilization, so much so that we don't even recognize it. Those ideas have a landing in our cultural unconscious. They feel right to some extent. And, and there's been, the ideas that have been put out about Israel from the beginning for years, for decades, resonate with that old anti-Semitism and update it for the modern age in the form of Israelophobia. And as I write in my book, the demonization of Israel demands destruction, just like it did in the Second World War.
Yeah.
The demonization of the Jews as being the dark force behind all that's malign in the world led to the obvious conclusion, well, if we want a better world, we need to exterminate the Jews. The drip of constant demonization of Israel that we've seen for decades as being baby killers, as being colonizers, as being white supremacists, as ethnic cleansers and apartheid state, racists. All those lies eventually lead to one conclusion, which is that the only way to make the world a better place is to get rid of the Jewish state.
So it's just been over a week now since Hamas's attack, the worst anti-Semitic atrocity since the Holocaust. And yet we're hearing that it's Israel, despite even they haven't even started their offensive properly, is engaged in an act of ethnic cleansing, is engaged in an act of genocide. I mean, what do you make of the way those words are thrown around?
Well, it's so incredibly cynical. It's so distorting of what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, Brendan wrote in his column this week about how everything that Israel does, it's accused of war crimes. If it tries to clear people out of the area, it's a war crime. If it tries to retaliate in any format, it's a war crime. There has been this kind of combination of, I think, muddled thinking amongst kind of centrist liberal opinion who seem desperate to turn this into a kind of both sides sort of conflict. They can just express their sympathy and concern for the innocents on all sides, which of course everyone has as a human being, I'm sure, and just kind of dwell in that without having to look at the specific vicious, racist, anti-Semitic, annihilationist, as you were suggesting there, Jake, kind of character of what Hamas did when they, launched that pogrom into southern Israel. And then, of course, you've got essentially the kind of Western Islamists and the woke left useful idiots who are, to a completely different degree, essentially just repeating kind of Hamas propaganda and so on. What's interesting at this point was that, again, you would think, given what happened that Saturday morning, given the enormity of it and all the rest of it, that it would make them look at this conflict in a slightly different way, and yet it really hasn't, to the point where when, again, the fires and explosions of that hospital were first reported, the rush to assign blame because it fit the Israelophobic narrative effectively, that's just not kind of morally deeply questionable. It also has tremendous real-world consequences, and we've seen that in the course of the past couple of days. First of all, with the kind of the protests that we've seen across various Arab states, the kind of more pressure that's being put on those particular regimes to intervene more heavily in one way or another. And most sickeningly, of course, we saw in Berlin, in Germany, where you had a synagogue that was firebombed, Molotov cocktails thrown at it. There is an incredibly high cost to the credulity of the media on these particular questions. And you would have hoped that, again, the enormity of the situation would have actually shaken them out of a combination of kind of lazy thinking, lazy journalism, and lazy prejudice, but it really hasn't. Going forward, you can only hope that this particular example serves as a lesson as to why it's so important that they don't just repeat Hamas press releases verbatim and treat that as a news report, which is essentially what has happened so far.
Definitely. And Jake, one thing that your book does very effectively is it takes on some of the sort of key myths that people, or I guess received ideas that people have about Israel, that it's a sort of colonialist, that it's necessarily violent or an apartheid state. I mean, what do you think are sort of the key ones that just need to be taken on?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you're talking about the received ideas. I think it's vital to understand where those ideas have been received from. And where they've been received from is Soviet propaganda during the Cold War, which was extensive and it was hugely funded. It was an operation that involved hundreds of books, thousands of hours of radio broadcasting, tens of thousands of leaflets, covert and overt diplomatic means, publications in the West, just a huge propaganda drive to turn the West against Israel, which was perceived as a bastion of American interests in the region. And all of the untruths which plague the debate today, which do not withstand the slightest scrutiny, were invented in the Kremlin by what was known as Zionologists, who were basically far-right ultra-nationalists who were told to put their anti-Semitism in the skin of Marxist-Leninist discourse. And in some cases, they did it only by changing the term Jew for Zionist.
Yeah.
And those lies include Israel is engaged in a genocide against the Palestinians. We hear that a lot, particularly now. Well, the Palestinian population has increased 5-fold since Israel's establishment. That's a pretty bad genocide. Israel is accused of being a white supremacist state. Well, more Israelis are non-white than are white. And even the ones who are white, that's questionable. Israel's accused of being a colonialist state. Look at the history. It's a post-colonial state arising as a result of a carve-up by the Allied powers following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, along with lots of other states, nation-states, Lebanon and Syria, for example, Pakistan and India, the position of Ireland, and so forth. It is called an apartheid state, probably first and foremost. Yeah. The head of Israel's national bank is an Arab. A Muslim Supreme Court judge has sentenced a former Israeli prime minister to prison for corruption. Pretty odd type of apartheid. Not only that, in the Arab states, there are no Jews because they've expelled them all. Where's the apartheid? There are 20% of Israel's population are Arabs. So all of these lies are quite easily disproven by a single look at the evidence. And yet, because of the effectiveness of Soviet propaganda, and because of, as we were saying, the sort of the backdrop of anti-Semitic assumptions which we carry with us because of our Christian inheritance, that these lies have become, widespread. People articulate them without thinking, and they're being updated all the time. I mean, just this at the moment, these past few days, people have said to me who aren't anti-Semitic have said to me, "Well, Gaza's an open-air prison, isn't it?" Why is Gaza an open-air prison? I mean, of course, Israel has been securing the border with Gaza, and the last 10 days have shown us exactly why it's had to do that. That's not the same as creating an open-air prison. Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza in 2005, gave them all of its resources, gave them all the infrastructure, and secured the border to protect its citizens. That's not an open-air prison. And this other lie, Gazans have nowhere to go. Israel tells them to move out of the firing zone. They've got nowhere to go. Well, I know someone in Gaza. My former colleague, I was formerly a foreign correspondent. My fixer is in Gaza now. He's Gazan. I spoke to him yesterday. He's in the south, staying with friends to avoid the violence. And it's not easy. Of course, there are attacks in the south as well. But people can move from one part of Gaza to another. And look, I'm not going to get into that right now. But what I'm saying is that there are so many untruths and bits of propaganda and lies that are circulating that are quite easily disproven. And a lot of them had the roots in the sinister Soviet propaganda effort that happened during the Cold War.
And Tom, another layer to this is the kind of identity politics that's been almost supercharged this kind of distaste for Jews. How have you seen that play into this in the past week or so?
Well, I think what's been really disturbing is that the kind of identitarian sort of pyramid of victimhood has been used to not only provide cover to Hamas terrorism. So in this very simplistic kind of narrative, the Hamas terrorists are effectively the oppressed, and even if they might act out a little bit, which is almost how they're describing this vicious, murderous pogrom, that's almost to be expected, which, as we've talked about on the show last week, I think is a profoundly racist way to talk about anyone. It's almost the suggestion that again the darker skinned people in this equation are naturally have no agency whatsoever of themselves. This is just what they do. So that's been incredibly grim. I think the other layer to it is something that has been building in supposedly progressive circles for some time now, which is not just making excuses for anti-Semitism, but is actually expressing its own virulent form of anti-Semitism. It's not just having a blind spot for Jew hatred, it's actually expressing it yourself. And you've seen that, as you were alluding to there, Jake, in the way in which the kind of fusion of the old, often ancient anti-Semitic tropes with the rage against Israel in the form of the idea that they're delighting in killing children, the idea that they have the rest of the West by the balls because they effectively control everything. The fact that, and this is a kind of the way in which these tropes would routinely appear in left-wing discourse, cartoons and so on, over and over again in recent years, and it's all just exploded out onto the surface once again. You see it also very much mirroring when you see people on the left talking about Israel having no right to exist. That is fundamentally what Hamas believes as well, and we've got a glimpse of what they would be prepared to do to bring about that kind of reality. So I think it's woken us up to how not only is that kind of woke politics a often quite perverse, unseemly, divisive way to look at questions of race, inequality and so on, but it has rehabilitated the world's oldest hatred in the midst of supposedly progressive people. And what's so deeply unsettling about it is that they really don't seem to recognise that whatsoever, even when it's pointed out to them again and again and again, essentially.
Yeah, there does seem to sort of be a denial about it. You know, people will insist that they are not being anti-Semitic or they have no intention to be. I mean, what's your experience been with that?
Well, I mean, the thing about anti-Semitism, one of its main characteristics is that it has no ability to recognise itself, and it's able to constantly present itself as being on the side of the angels, as being a virtuous thing. I mean, going back to the Middle Ages, it was legitimized in the language of Christianity, of religion.
Yeah.
You know, it was right to oppress, marginalize, massacre, expel the Jews because they killed Christ. So it was God's work in some way. You were on the side of the angels. In the 20th century, as I mentioned, it was only right to, marginalize, expel, and murder the Jews en masse because you were exterminating a malign influence from the world. So the SS were told that it's a hard job, but you've got to do it for the sake of your children, grandchildren, and the world. They believed they were doing the right thing, or tried to believe it. In fact, in Hannah Arendt's book on the banality of evil, her famous book about the Eichmann trial, she talks very vividly about this moral inversion.
Yeah.
Whereby in ordinary times, people know that we mustn't kill, steal, send people to their deaths, rob their possessions, and so forth. Even if in the back of people's mind, occasionally you might feel like it, that is suppressed. Whereas during the Nazi period, it was inverted.
Yeah.
So you were told, you must kill, you must steal, you must send 6 million people to their deaths. And people did it, and they were able to suppress the small voice in the back of their head that said, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. And you see the same thing today, that the hatred of Jews is given this legitimization. It's taken on in exactly the same way, the language of virtue. I mean, the Jews are accused of all of the cardinal sins of our age, of identity politics.
Yeah.
As we said, they're accused of racism. Israel's a racist state, we're told, because racism is the cardinal sin of 2023. They're accused of ethnic cleansing, of white supremacy, of apartheid. All the worst things that our culture derides is pinned on Israel.
Yeah.
In exactly the same way. And so it's natural, if you're somebody who would fight against oppression, fight against apartheid, fight against racism, fight against the Jews. It's the right thing to do. It's that siren voice, that seduction. You can feel like a good person. You can channel all that righteous anger and rage into destroying the world's only Jewish state, and you can be applauded for doing so. And that is clearly exactly the same form of anti-Semitism, but reskinned to become Israelophobia, as I say in my book.
Sorry, Fraser, I know you want to move on, but the one thing I'd say is, as well, and this has become a feature of the discussion, is people are often trying to change the subject. So they'll often say, but of course, aren't you concerned about the plight of the innocents of Gaza? Of course, everyone you ask who is sane will say, of course, they're concerned about that. But that concern has to at least begin with a recognition of the fact that it is a disaster and a tragedy that they've become to be led by these theocratic, genocidal lunatics who hold them in complete contempt, who have openly, explicitly said they use them as human shields. Direct quotes. This is not something that's been projected or just described of them. This is something that they've bragged about previously, who in previous situations have also killed innocent lives because of their rockets misfiring and so on. There's been examples you point out in your book, Jake, about the New York Times portraying certain Gazans as the victims of Israeli airstrikes when actually that is what had taken place in certain instances. The leadership of this organisation in Qatar are living in absolute luxury. I mean, the gentleman who put out the call for global jihad the other week, Khalid Mashawi, has this multi-billion property portfolio. These are people who are not on the side of the Palestinians. They've put them in abject threat, not just throughout this current crisis, but previously as well. And surely if people want to really express their concern and solidarity and so on, it should at least begin with a recognition that allowing this theocratic medieval cult to rule over them is the defining tragedy in this particular period.
And it's so interesting, isn't it, that when people like me say, you're not treating Israel fairly, you're judging Israel by different standards, you're demonizing Israel, look at how you look at how you judge the other countries in the world, then the chorus is, oh, that's whataboutery. And yet, when they say, now, what about Gaza? Suddenly the idea of whataboutery seems to vanish like morning dew.
Surfing the web without ExpressVPN is like letting your dog run around without a lead. I mean, it'll probably be fine, but what if your beloved pet just decides to take off one day? Or what if it gets stolen? It's always better to play it safe, especially when being safe is as easy as using ExpressVPN. Whenever you connect to an unsecured network, like in a hotel or an airport, your data is left wide open. That means any hacker on that network can swipe your personal info. But with ExpressVPN, your device links up securely to the internet and keeps cyber snoops at bay. It would take a hacker with a supercomputer more than 1 billion years to crack ExpressVPN's protection. And the best bit? ExpressVPN works on all your gadgets, whether it's your phone, laptop, tablet, or even your smart TV. Plus, it's super easy to use. You just fire up the app, hit one button, and you're instantly protected. At Spiked, we know how important it is to protect your privacy and keep your data safe. That's why all of us use ExpressVPN to browse the web securely and privately. And now you can get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free by going to expressvpn.com/spiked. That's expressvpn.com/spiked to get that extra special offer. expressvpn.com/spiked. So, tragically, Islamist terrorism has returned to Europe on Friday in Arras in northern France. A teacher was stabbed. And then on Monday, 3 Swedish people were shot. 2 of them died ahead of a football match friendly in Brussels. Tom, these events came after the call you alluded to earlier, about the call to jihad from a leader of Hamas. But we don't necessarily know that they are linked. In any case, it is still a very worrying development.
I mean, it would be a hell of a coincidence is one thing to say. I mean, in both of these cases, so the 20-year-old in northern France, as you were suggesting, he pledged allegiance to the Islamic State previously, but the authorities there are still saying that they're open to this being linked to the Hamas conflict because, as we've already been talking about, this is very much seen in the context of a kind of global Islamist terrorist movement. Similarly, the shootings in Brussels, again, yet the individual who has actually been shot and killed by police now pledged allegiance to the Islamic State beforehand. It would seem that part of the motive here relates to the recent Quran burning controversies in Sweden, which he makes a kind of oblique reference to in one of his videos. But again, the authorities there are leaving open the possibility that this is connected in some way, inspired, was the spark for something that he might have been wanting to do for some time. And so it's really kind of brought it home. But then it hasn't, because certainly in the UK at least, I mean, I know there's obviously a lot going on in the world right now, but particularly the attack in northern France was talked about for about an hour and then completely moved on from. And that was something that I found particularly chilling. And in both cases, actually, they really underline the tremendous failure that various Western European governments have had in trying to tackle this particular problem with allowing it to incubate amongst certain portions of the population, just in basic security failures as well. I mean, in the case of the Brussels shooter, who is a Tunisian national, he has been on the radar of the authorities since 2016. He was actually there illegally. He had his asylum application rejected in 2020. They were already aware that he had been radicalised, but the response of the Belgian Justice Minister was, we had so many referrals at that point, it was impossible to keep track of him. And a not dissimilar picture in relation to the 20-year-old Chechen who committed this horrible atrocity in northern France, who was a known Islamist extremist. He was interviewed by the French by the French security services the day before he launched this particular attack. His father, who was seemingly also an extremist, was deported in 2018. So again, you've kind of got this sense of foreboding and a kind of sense of, could we be on the kind of cusp of another kind of wave of these kinds of attacks, which have been given a kind of rocket fuel by what's been going on in Israel. But at the same time, there being that real inability to grasp the threat amongst various Western European countries, which seems struck with the same problem, which is that there is a small minority, but a not insignificant amount of people who are fully paid up Islamist terrorists waiting for an opportunity to strike. And you just can't help but feel that, as ever, there's been a kind of sense of complacency in taking that threat seriously.
Yeah, Jake, it does feel like, whenever these attacks happen, we do move on very quickly. We don't seem to, have much of a discussion about how to actually, properly confront this threat, even though it's persistent. It's been around for decades. What do you make of that kind of sort of response?
Well, I mean, I was very involved in the last spate of terror attacks that started off in 2015 in Vatican. Because back then I was a foreign reporter, and so I covered them all from on the ground. Yeah. The Bataclan attacks in Paris, Nice, Stockholm, Berlin, Istanbul, Sri Lanka, the bombings there, and others that I've left out. Berlin, Brussels.
Yeah.
And in each of those, or many of those cases, the attackers came from areas of the city, their respective cities, that were almost no-go zones for police. In Brussels, for example. In Brussels, I recall covering the attacks there some years ago. And they came from Molenbeek. And Molenbeek is it is one of those. It's almost exclusively populated by first generation, second generation immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa and Africa itself. It's very, very hard to police. There's a lot of extremism there, and I remember from the time that the local population closed ranks to protect those terrorists, even though they didn't necessarily support them in their ideology. There was enough sympathy and suspicion of the outside of police to close ranks, and this is a significant problem. Yeah. Significant problem. I mean, cities in Sweden where I've covered the gang warfare there, which is coming out of those, immigrant communities. A lot of it has came over into Europe with the migration trail, which again I covered because it was really beginning when I when I started off on the road. And it's a policing nightmare. It's very, very hard to follow all these strains of gangland violence, of mafioso, tribal warfare, and of jihadism, some of which overlap or interlink or support each other, relate to each other. And I think that really outside of that, in the West as a whole, I think we do not have the moral structure with which to acknowledge what's going on without being afraid that we're being racist. Yeah. We don't have the language. We don't have the confidence in ourselves that we're not racist. We don't have that confidence to be able to recognize the problem and diagnose it and deal with it without undermining ourselves, fearing that we're racist. It's a bit like the Rochdale grooming gangs, partly because for years we've been undermining our own sense of self, undermining our own moral compass but with all this this move to campaign against ourselves and against our history and against our values, that we're structurally racist, that we have white privilege without even realizing it, that we're racist by default, that we have this original sin that we're post-lapsarian, we're born in sin, we're born in the sin of racism, and we can't breathe, we can't act, we can't make judgments, we can't stand up for ourselves and our values because all of that is tainted with entrenched racism. And therefore, we don't have the ability to look at these problems in immigrant communities realistically for what they are. Within that, it is, as you were saying, is a sort of reverse racism.
Yeah.
That we can't treat them like every other citizen of this country or of the West or of Europe and enforce properly and expect the same standards as we expect of other citizens. The only way is to turn a blind eye because we don't want to be racist, and therefore it's the soft bigotry of low expectations that we express towards them.
Yeah.
So it's this total moral mess that we found ourselves in. And it all comes from undermining our own values willfully. It's self-sabotage that we've been engaging in for not just a few years, but for a long time in this country, that's hollowed out our moral fibre and made us unable to deal with this sort of situation.
I think that's a really important point as well, because I think the moral mess that we're in, sorting that out is the prerequisite for all the other problems. This is not just a technical issue.
Yeah.
Insofar as do we have enough people keeping tabs on known extremists and so on. If you fundamentally don't take the threat seriously, and the fact that it all stems from this bizarre situation we've ended up with, which is to be a good person, you have to ignore some very terrible things. You have to turn a blind eye to some of the most horrendous abuse, terrorism, you name it, is something that we've really got to get a grip on, not least because of the fact that it's so frankly ridiculous. It helps absolutely no one, and also it buys into what seem to me to be some pretty basic stereotypes. I mean, the idea that to take Islamist terrorism seriously risks alienating British Muslims, say, is to conflate the two perfectly. It's to suggest that the Venn diagram is actually just a circle. But that's essentially how people carry on. And I think it's worth, just as an example, I mean, it's almost 2 years to the day since David Amos was murdered in his constituency surgery by an Islamist terrorist. 2 years ago, that's something which is, broadly speaking, forgotten about. He's talked about almost as if he died of an unfortunate accident or something like this. And if anyone remembers the debate that we had after that, it was absurd. It was about how we need to clamp down on people trolling politicians on the internet. We need to be kind to politicians. Aren't they nice, kind, serving people, and so on? There was a proposal for a David's Law to stop people being mean to politicians on the internet when he wasn't killed by a tweet.
Yeah.
But the ability to displace the actual problem because of this profound fear of being racist, which can actually end up with you being racist, if you see what I mean, is something that surely has got to be brought a stop to if we're going to actually tackle this. But there's just no signs of that awakening, shall we say, on the part of the elites at this point.
So the Australian public has quite decisively rejected a proposal for what was called the Voice to Parliament. This would essentially have set up a constitutionally affirmed body that would have been able to advise the government or the Parliament of the day on Indigenous affairs. But a lot of the details we actually were left out by the Labour Prime Minister who put this forward. 60% voted no one in every single Australian state. And it's come as a bit of a shock to the Australian political class, Tom.
Yeah, no, it's very reminiscent of the kind of wake of Brexit or the Trump referendum, as far as the recriminations have been pretty embittered on waking up to realise that it's such a horrible racist country, people threatening to leave, all these kinds of tropes that we've become accustomed to. I'm always struck by the shock that a lot of the kind of campaigners on the losing sides of these referendums have. First of all, because it reflects a kind of detachment from your fellow citizens, which is quite profound in this case, as it was in Brexit and others. But also because of the fact that surely this result perfectly fits your narrative, which is...
Didn't they think we were racist anyway?
Full of horrible racist people who, of course, wouldn't actually accept this kind of setup. So all of that's been very, very familiar. But again, and this is a sort of theme of a lot of our discussion today, it just strikes me as getting things entirely the wrong way around. I mean, what this proposal was trying to do was to try and dilute the idea of one person, one vote, but for supposedly politically progressive reasons. I mean, it was trying to effectively formalise and place a form of identity politics into the Australian constitution itself to suggest there are different kinds of citizens on the basis of race. I mean, there was a very strong attempt to underplay what this body would actually be, but the fact that they had to have a referendum on it at all speaks to what a profound change it would have been. Even the Labour Prime Minister said it would have taken a very brave government to ignore what this particular advisory body might have proposed, And there was all sorts of debates about whether or not it would even have kind of legal force, that if you ended up having to fight this out through the courts, what would happen. So it was a profound change, and one that was quite, in a sense, reactionary, because it was about trying to do away with a kind of very Australian sort of egalitarian sort of ideal and suggest that, no, you do have to carve people up, and carve them up in such a way that would make division permanent, that would suggest that white Australians are forever stained by racial guilt, effectively, and that Aboriginal Australians are forever the kind of victims of history. So for a campaign that was supposed to be about finally closing the gap, it seemed to actually just want to enshrine the gap forever in the Australian Constitution. So I'm very glad it was rejected. It's another reminder that democracy is often the great sort of bulwark against all of these dreadful ideas. But the losing side are not taking it well, to put it lightly, definitely. And
Jake, it seems as if this example seems like a sort of perfect example where in modern identity politics, we've abandoned the sort of Martin Luther King ideal of all are created equal, judge people by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. And we've gone for this, actually, let's judge people by their skin colour again. Let's treat people according to their race.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't help but wonder that if this law would have passed, how would you be able to define an Aboriginal person?
Precisely, yeah.
There would need to have been some quite complex race laws. What happens if you're, to use a slightly loaded term, Mischlinge, mixed race? That obviously derives from the Nazi era with people who were half Jewish. How much Aboriginal blood would you need to qualify for this extra status? Would you, in order to preserve that Aboriginal bloodline, in order to preserve that voice, would you need to have some sanction against marrying somebody who was non-Aboriginal? I'm being slightly provocative, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that your point about Martin Luther King is a very pertinent one, because this is American stuff.
Yeah.
This is not Australian stuff. This is the imported ideas from the States, just in the same way as we've imported Black Lives Matter principles.
Yeah.
And as Tomiwa Orilade talks about in his book, This Is Not America, we've started using terms like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Person of Colour. Well, Indigenous here, let's say, does not mean quite the same thing.
It's quite a loaded description.
When it comes up, you want to run a mile.
Yeah.
and if you wind back to Martin Luther King, at that time, his principle was integrationist. I'm black and I'm American, and I'm equally as American as you. Talking to a white person.
Yeah.
I belong here. I'm of this place. And the Jews stood shoulder to shoulder with him in that fight. And there is a stream of thought that supported that approach. James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, people like that. But that was supplanted by the Black Power movement, by essentially a radical left sort of socialist movement, which rejected Americanness as an identity in favour for Pan-Africanism, the nation of black people. We're black and we're not of this place, and being black is our identity, and that's kind of brought with it critical race theory, and the idea that black people, and the sort of militant approach of not seeking to integrate but seeking to isolate and overcome. And all of that has been imported into the Australian debate, where it's not enough for the Aboriginal community to be seen as equal in a way that looks beyond race. They've got to be seen as more than equal, to compensate, to elevate them from downtrodden to above the people who were oppressing them. And all of this sort of all of these very toxic anti-democratic ideas, as you said, come from America. And from a Jewish point of view as well. Jews always get lumped onto the side of the white oppressor, because of the myth of Jewish power. So it feels relevant and personal to me from that point of view. But certainly, I'm, like Tom, very glad that it was rejected.
Tom, just finally, clearly there are huge problems that Indigenous people face in Australia. Huge gap in education, in wages, and all kinds of things like that. But wasn't something like this really more geared towards the elite, I guess, whether that's Aboriginal elites, but also, the white elite just quite like this idea, it seems.
Well, it's overwhelmingly the most enthusiastic sections of the Australian population for the yes side were metropolitan, quite wealthy voters who I'm sure skewed heavily white Australian. Now, it's worth pointing out, it seems by the polls that the majority of Aboriginal people did vote for this, which is not a huge shock necessarily. But it is also working out. There was a diversity of opinion. I mean, the leader of the No campaign was a woman called Jacinta Price, who is of Aboriginal heritage herself. There are a number of very prominent Aboriginal people who were campaigning for No precisely because of the reason that they were saying this has nothing to do with closing those inequalities that you talk about, which are particularly concentrated in the very rural or very remote parts of Australia, where there are all kinds of profound social, economic problems which have never really properly been dealt with. And a point they made, what I thought was very powerful, and I think gets to the heart of a lot of what's wrong with this identity politics, is that it's fundamentally not really interested in solving these problems. It's not fundamentally interested in realising the promise of equality and so on. It's about making this classification as victim permanent because it provides a perverse, if limited, form of power and empowerment in that sort of sense. Well, I think what we've seen is a complete rejection of that, and that can only really be for the positive, because not only is it divisive and ugly in all the ways that we've been talking about, it's also a fundamental dead end for people on the ground, which is why, as I say, it was very encouraging to see us rejected so emphatically.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.